Sorry that I'm capped at 15 minutes, so I'm just going to talk about the single head for agencies and separate line and staff. So in other words, when we have an organization that has two bosses, let's say some division of that organization has to respond to two different people, they'll automatically get conflicting directions for how to run that agency and who they report to. So it's important that there's a single head for all these agencies, a single head for every division of responsibility, because otherwise you'll pull the organization apart. And then inside each organization there should be thinkers and there should be doers. In other words, there's a staff line and there's pure staff, and these pure staff end up helping support the organization, paperwork, travel requests, coordination of meetings, other things. And then there's the other portion that makes decisions, does critical analysis, and sort of is the leading, guiding portion of that organization. Now, that was Gulick. Now, Weber is slightly different. Weber talks about the bureaucracy as a way to overcome authority problems. So under traditional authority, organizations exist because that's the way they've always existed. And maybe that's because someone's been loyal to this hierarchy for a long time. Think about chiefs or kings or something like that. But when there's threats to the legitimacy of that tradition, then it can destabilize organizations. Charismatic authority prompts people to go against maybe laws even, or other organizational standards, to follow the dictates of an individual. This is also highly disruptive to a system of authority and doing work inside organizations. A charismatic authority would maybe argue that we should completely gut the organization and change it in order to do the dictates of that individual person. The problem with authority, that's charismatic authority, is that it can undermine legal authority. It can override sort of rational thought, and if the person dies or maybe asks us to do something we're not supposed to do, or passes away, that system of authority disappears. So Weber focuses a lot on rational legal authority. Legal authority established through impersonal order. This says that this is the most efficient, the best long-standing version, and this is what we typically think about inside U.S. Public organizations, that no one's higher than the law, that the law dictates or drives the position, the power, authority of an individual. And let's say, for example, someone is not elected again, they lose that power and authority, and whoever is elected to that position, then they receive that legitimacy and that authority. The same thing goes for the head of the CIA or the FBI or the Department of Interior. When somebody comes into a position, they assume that responsibility. When they're no longer in that position of authority or responsibility, they no longer have that authority or responsibility. And that creates a system that can have continuity over time. Okay, the major alternative to the structural approach is systems theory. And systems theory more or less goes like this. Instead of looking at a whole set of delegated authorities and responsibilities, let's look at the organization as part of a system. It's essentially a box. If you look at the textbook, it'll show this big box diagram that says organization on it. And then it'll have inputs into the organization, outputs the organization, some feedback to help us inform what we need to do, and then some outcomes. Systems theory is able to be generalized between public and private organizations, large and small organizations, and it uses analogies from the physical and biological fields. We often think of these as open systems. Essentially, a system or this organization receives some inputs. This could be resources like money, staff, direction or authority. It changes those inputs into some outputs. It throughputs them, and then it provides some outputs. We see what's going on in that system by looking at those outputs. We get some feedback, and the feedback is used to inform how the system functions. Okay, so let me talk briefly about how this might work as a way to think about a system. One of the things we think about is what the system functions, what it does, what its boundaries are. The agency has a specific set of responsibility. It does a certain function, but it doesn't really, people who think about systems don't really care about the division of labor inside that system. They just think about how that system functions. So let's think about like the criminal justice system inside a state. So there's a criminal justice system. You think about prisons. In systems theory, they'd say, well, okay, let's look to see how well that prison system is working as a public organization by what it took in. how much money it used, how many prisoners were given to the system. Then we'd look at the output, how much money was spent, what facilities happened, what sort of outcomes happened, but also how many people left the system. We'd use feedback from the people leaving the system, their expenditures, any other information we got about the prison system to improve the inputs. So we'd use that feedback to modify the system's boundaries, what it can and can't do. And essentially, these systems start to evolve based on adaptations to the external environment, the type of inputs they're getting, the sort of internal threats there are. If there are some workplace problems, maybe something's not working inside the system, so they adapt or modify that. Essentially, the whole purpose of the system is to perform a specific function that's like an agency's mission, and to translate these inputs into outputs. Just a brief comment about systems theory versus structural theory. If we're thinking about something like a structural approach to looking at the prison system, we would look at how delegated authority comes through the law to the state prison system. And then we'd look at who is in charge of what thing. Would we look, and Gulick would say, well, let's look at subdivisions from the top. Have we defined ways in which that authority is delegated to different areas, like building maintenance, rehabilitation, prison patrolling, inputs, processing, education, human resources? Have we delegated that authority in a reasonable way? Have we given power accordingly so we can fulfill that function? And in order to check to see if that system was working well, or that organization was working well, we'd look at all those chains of hierarchy. We try to minimize inefficiencies and make sure that it was focusing on purpose. Okay, that's one way to look at the prison system. The systems theory way to look at the prison system is to say, who did it take in? How did it process them? Are we getting any better? Are we getting any worse? What's the function of that system? And is it adapting or moving well? Okay, so that's the comparison between systems theory and structural theory. But there's some real problems with both of these. This is one of my very favorite. It's called a demotivator. You know, we have motivational posters. Oh, this is so great. Every time I think about the structural theory, I see this cog, and I actually have one up here on my shelf. You can kind of, maybe you can't even see it. It's this big metal cog, and it says, you know, it's just a piece of machinery. I love the demotivator because it says, just because you're necessary doesn't mean you're important. And I think, wait, am I that guy? Well, under the structural theory, if I performed a specific function, if I did a specific task, if I had a specific set of roles or responsibilities, I could be replaced. Me, Dr. Tucker, could be replaced any time by somebody who could perform the same function. And I feel like so worthless inside a big system, right? Well, that was one of the biggest critiques of the structural approach. The structural approach more or less said, hey, people don't really matter. Just as long as you define the authority, you define the position, the system's going to work just fine. Well, in the systems theory, we don't have anything about people. Just, you know, this organization processes inputs and outputs. Under the structural approach, did we delegate authority properly to a specific set of positions? Well, there were a whole bunch of people called the humanists, especially humanists who think about organizational theory. They said people matter. Organizations aren't just structures and procedures, they're people. People bring different things to the table. Well, we'll talk about that. There's this other group called the pluralists. They say organizations respond to internal and external pressures. Organizations behave differently. They create different rules and procedures in order to process their work because they know they have some external and internal threats. Government by proxy, people said, well, the structural model says we delegate authority inside the organization to these things, but what happens if we delegate authority to third parties, like other roles of government or private companies to do our work for us? How do we deal with accountability? How do we deal with system processes if they're outside of our system? Well, we got to think about organizations differently. And then we already talked about the rational approach, the formal approach, that organizations at their core are sets of relationships that are essentially contractual relationships. So all these four different challenges to the structural approach and to systems theory have added new light and understanding to the way that we think about organizations and how they function. So let's talk about the humanists. Humans matter. People matter. I think I matter. I think you matter. I don't know you, but, you know, we'll take a guess. Chances are you bring a unique set of skills and traits to your job, even if you have the same qualifications of the person who came before you. This sort of came to be part of org theory early on in the 1900s, where this guy named Frederick Taylor went around studying how to make organizations more efficient. And he asked workers to perform tasks, and he would time them. And he would say, okay, well, we're going to make the organization more efficient by making you work faster. It's like, no, that's not how it works. And the humanists have sort of said, workplace environment matters to people. People bring different skill sets, and we're just not like machines, like some cog in a machine. And so the spawn of that was that we had the human relations movement in the 50s that said, happy workers are more productive. And that could be really true, that if people change their behavior, if we create a nice workplace environment, then the organization is not going to suffer as much. And if we have happy people, that'll be good, right? So we did things like sensitivity training. We now call this like diversity training. We talk about emotional intelligence, and we minimize fights, and we talk about fairness, and we try to instill in these workers like a great place to work. Now, what's great is that that's a really, really good idea. Nobody really likes going to work where their work is horrible. But how we manage matters. So if I've got somebody watching over me all the time, I might speed up my work, but I also might make more mistakes. Or I might be mad because I've got somebody watching over me. And just because I'm happy doesn't mean I'm going to be more productive, because maybe I'm happy and I go and stand by the water cooler all day long. Or I feel like I'm more relaxed in my position. Or because it's a comfortable place, I slow down. So there's mixed results about humanists, because in some ways this is absolutely true. We don't want to have a horrible workplace environment, but in some of those really horrible workplace environments, we have really effective workers. And in some of the most relaxed places, we have really effective workers, and we also have really ineffective workers. But what we do know from the humanists is that people matter. People bring a different skill set to their job. They bring different tools. They bring friendship. They bring interpersonal skills that maybe aren't available to us to see in a structural approach, but could be really influential in how the government does its job. Okay. The second sort of critique was the pluralists, and they said organizations respond to external and internal threats and politically active interest groups. And these organizations are the byproduct of this conflict and accommodation of interests. So I used to work as a consultant, and we would work with the Office of Surface Mining. I worked for a company that did surface mining, and we would work with the Office of Surface Mining to get projects approved and to make some slight rule changes in how they enforce the law. Well, we came upon a project one time, and I was working on the Navajo Nation. So when in this meeting, we were trying to get approval to make some changes. So we needed the Navajo Nation there, a representative from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We were going to do something that was going to affect water, so we had the EPA. I was one of those consultants. We had a citizens group there who was very, very afraid of what the mine was doing, and they were careful about the environment. And then we had, besides me, we had the industry there. We had the company. And as we're meeting with the Office of Surface Mining, we were trying to pitch these ideas, and we have people who are concerned about social and environmental issues. We have engineers who are thinking about structural problems with what we were planning on doing, water quality. And, the mine just wanted to do what it needed to do. But the Office of Surface Mining was going to make sure that everyone else at the table felt good about the decision from the Office of Surface Mining before they issued a permit. Now, afterwards, I've had time to reflect on what was going on. The Office of Surface Mining really needed us, the regulated, and the consultants, to prove that what we were going to do was not going to be bad. Because they knew that if we had some shoddy work, then the citizens were going to sue. Or that the EPA was going to come after the Office of Surface Mining and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Navajo Nation. There were going to be all these different complaints. And so the behavior inside the Office of Surface Mining and their policies and procedures wanted to ensure that these people could be accommodated. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that the Office of Surface Mining takes on a different culture. It knows who it has to interact with. And because of that, it changes its procedures. Even though it's in the same Department of the Interior somewhere else, it has a unique set of positions. Just like if we were policing in LA versus policing in in Beverly Hills in LA versus somewhere like Watts. The police are going to have different ways to engage those different groups of people, because they know that those different people have different needs and needs accommodation, different political levers that they can pull to change that organization. This could be the same LAPD, but the different areas are going to have different vested interests. So they take on these different ways of performing their duties. Organizational culture is a big component part of of this pluralist approach that we'll talk about in just a second.